Wayne, before we get to talking about the stories that you have about the history we don't know, I want to talk a little bit about the special event this year. Of course, this is the 200th birthday of the city of Memphis and Shelby County as well. So we're celebrating this bicentennial, but since you're a historian, I've got you sitting in front of me.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about the founding of the city. How did we get here?
Well, if we were to go back 200 years to Memphis, we would see mostly wooded areas, but on what was called the Fourth Chickasaw Bluff, or what became known as the Fourth Chickasaw Bluff, you would have seen elements of towns. The earliest residents of the Memphis area were several bands of Indians. They went by various names, some of them we don't even know, but they are collectively known as the Mississippian culture. Mississippian because not only proximity to the Mississippi River, but also because they moved beyond sort of traditional hunter-gatherer organizations and tribes to building towns. And a central part of those towns are very large burial mounds, and we can see a burial mound in Memphis. We can see several actually at Chucalissa, of course, which is an early Mississippian town, and then also in the French Fort area over by where the Marine Hospital is now is Chickasaw Heritage Park. Used to be called Desoto Park for Hernando Desoto, who we'll talk about in just a second, but there's a burial mound there, and through archaeological work, archaeologists and historians have been able to sort of recreate the life, and so it was a very sophisticated town. They had different professions: people who made pottery, people who made weapons, and who made things from metal. And they traded first with other tribes, and then when we start to see Europeans moving into the area, first with, as I mentioned, Hernando Desoto in the 1500s arriving here looking for gold and silver, but instead what he finds is several Mississippian cultures, pre-Chickasaw. And there are violent encounters between DeSoto and the native tribes. DeSoto eventually dies, does not survive to go back to Spain. 100 or so years later, a second expedition comes through, represented by the French government. And the Spanish do not really settle this area. They simply are looking for riches. They're not really interested in colonization. Neither are the French, although the riches they are looking for is not gold and silver, but fur. The fur trade in the 16th and 17th centuries is a very sophisticated economy, ties North America to Europe, ties this area to Europe for the first time. And so the French built a fort here, and recognizing its strategic location, high on the bluff, overlooking the Mississippi River. And so the French build a fort here. Eventually, there is a struggle in the 17th century and 18th century over who in Europe is ultimately going to control this area, whether it is going to be the Spanish, the French, the English. And then, of course, the American Revolution comes, and the United States lays claim to this area. And eventually, when America begins to, in the 1790s, begins to claim this area and wants to establish a fort here, then the Spanish decide to reintroduce their control over this area. Memphis becomes the capital of the Spanish Mississippi Territory. The governor of the Mississippi Territory, a man named Governor Manuel de la Gayoso, which is a name that is familiar to most. Yes. And so you see a Spanish culture begin to develop here, although it doesn't last very long, a couple of years. The Spanish are eventually pushed out through treaties with the United States. And so the United States establishes a fort here, and even more importantly, they establish a trading post, which was called a factory. And by this time, these various Mississippian tribes had evolved. Some tribes died out, others joined other tribes, took on a new name, and eventually became the Chickasaw Indians, which were the dominant tribe in the Memphis area when Europeans really began to settle this area. So so the Chickasaws nominally control this area, although they use it mostly for a hunting ground and some trading, but no permanent towns. The Chucalissa town has disappeared by this time, and so there is no permanent sort of Chickasaw town here. So they're in and out of this region, and so the United States establishes the trading post to trade with the Chickasaws, and but at the same time, the United States lays claim to this property. The state of North Carolina claims that this area belongs to North Carolina. Of course, Tennessee is founded in 1796, so there's a disputed claim with Tennessee. And then there are Revolutionary War soldiers who were given land grants instead of pay during the war. And there was a man named John Rice who was given a land grant for this area. He eventually sold it to Marcus Winchester, John Overton, and then Overton shared part of the land grant with Andrew Jackson, his close friend. And so they are the ones who claim ownership of the land. So when the United States signs a treaty with the Chickasaws in 1818, then the federal government buys the land from the Chickasaws, and then they honor, at least in part, the land grants that had been claimed by Jackson, Overton, and Winchester. And
so in a way, Memphis was a business deal.
Memphis was absolutely a business deal between the Chickasaws, the United States government, and the three men who are collectively known as the proprietors. And they are the ones who lay out the town and who established the promenade, for example, downtown, which of course we're still discussing because it was set aside to be public land in perpetuity. So that's how Memphis is founded, and it's because of its location on the river. It was already an important trading center before the city was founded and laid out, and of course would continue after.
And these investors, I'm sure, saw the value in that.
They did indeed, and they hoped that Memphis would become a major metropolitan center in this part of the world because of its connection to the river, its close proximity to the river. And in some ways, their dreams were fulfilled. In other ways, not so much. It took a long time for Memphis to grow after 1819. Memphis was populated by and large by poor people, rivermen and their families who settled in this area, who weren't terribly interested in government of any kind. And so there was this struggle between the settlers who were already here, who didn't want to be controlled. They certainly didn't want to pay taxes. And from there, the proprietors who want this to be this metropolis. And they want to keep it this small little place that they control. And in some ways, that's a story that continues to today, right?
It's amazing how history just follows.
That's right, exactly.
All right, well, let's talk about, now that we've celebrated a little bit of our bicentennial, let's talk about some of the history we don't know. The first thing that you sent me about the Cynthia Milk Fund. Now, I had heard of the Cynthia Milk Fund in the past. I knew of it as a charity. I was curious as to what happened to it because I haven't seen it in the news lately. But this is over 100 years old, right?
That's right. In 1914, there was the assistant society editor of a local newspaper, a woman, I should say, named Memory McCord, which is an unusual, great name, especially for a reporter, right, who has to memorize things.
But she doesn't write under that.
But she does not, which is interesting to me. But anyway, Memory McCord, assistant society editor, but she doesn't just cover sort of society events. If a story breaks the city editor has to find somebody to go cover a story. Well, he pulls whoever he's got. And on this particular day, in the winter of 1914, he gets a tip about some sort of violent incident that's taking place in an apartment building in a poor part of downtown. So he doesn't have anybody else. He says, hey, Memory, I need you to go out and cover the story. He gives the address. She rushes over there, knocks on the door, and the door swings open, and she realizes this is not the apartment I was sent to because there's nothing going on here. But she sees a very emaciated woman, young woman, and sees, there's almost no furniture in this place. It just looks as poor as any place she's ever seen. And she, out of the corner of her eye, she sees a pile of what she thinks are rags on the floor. And so she's sort of taking all this in and trying to figure out, why am I here and what is going on? She sees the rags start to move. So she goes up to the rags, pulls them apart, and finds a little child, a little baby, just a few months old. And the baby is not crying, but it's clear to her that this baby is malnourished, and so is the woman. And she talks to her, gets her story. Her story was that she and her husband had 3 children. He had a good job. They had plenty of food to eat and plenty of money for clothes and shelter and so on. But then one day, he contracted a quote-unquote incurable disease. Now, the newspaper accounts don't say. Back then, they were a little more delicate about such things. And he sought treatment, couldn't work. They quickly found themselves destitute, and he got to the point to where he felt that he was such a burden for his family. They had lost all their savings. They'd been kicked out of their house. They were living in flop houses like this place his wife and child was at. And when the baby came, he was in such despair that he ended his life because he felt that his family would be better off without him, which was almost certainly not true, but that's unfortunately sometimes what happens. So this woman has nowhere to go. She doesn't know who to reach out to. She's just sitting in this hovel. And what's interesting about Memory McCord is, she could have very easily turned away, like so many of us do when we were faced with suffering. But instead, she talked to the mother some more. Then when she left, there was a drugstore right next to the apartment house, or very near, and she went to the drugstore and said, deliver milk to this home every day for the next month, and she paid for it. Then she goes back to her newspaper office and bats out a story and tells everybody in Memphis what horrible conditions this woman lives under. Well, Memphis has always been a generous place. We may be collectively poor, but we're not ever poor enough to where we don't share what we have, and that's very much a part of Memphis history, and this is a perfect example of that. People read the story, were so overwhelmed by this woman's situation that they sent food, they sent money, so much that the family couldn't use all of it. And so the newspaper decided it was originally the Memphis Press, then it became the News Scimitar, then it became the Press Scimitar. And the newspaper decided, we're going to create a fund to help other children as well as this family. And Memory McCord, as we said, is a wonderful name, but she wrote under the name Cynthia Gray, which makes absolutely no sense to me. But Cynthia Gray was her pen name, so it became the Cynthia Milk Fund. And it became one of the most important charities in the city. At first, it was simply to raise money to provide milk for underprivileged children. But starting in the 1930s and then in the 1940s, the health community, the health care community in Memphis, decided that there was much more that could be done with this. They started Cynthia clinics. all across the city to work with not only to help poor children to get the nourishment they needed to develop properly, but also to help the parents learn how to take care of their children. And so we see all of this early childhood development that begins to be created through the Cynthia clinics. And then they partner with the University of Tennessee Medical School, and they're raising thousands of dollars every year. The newspaper, it is one of their official charities that they promote heavily. And every year, it was a favorite charity of Elvis Presley, as a matter of fact. That was one of the ones that he supported regularly. And so it grew to be much more than just handing out milk to poor kids. And
does it still exist?
It still exists. The Commercial Appeal, when the Press Scimitar folded in 1983, Commercial Appeal took it over, and it was one of their official charities. But in 2005, they dropped it as an official charity, and but it still exists. It is a part of Le Bonheur Children's Hospital. They have a Cynthia Milk Fund office, and it essentially does what the clinics did, and also does parenting classes and nutrition classes, and works with their clients. So it still very much exists, and is still doing great work in the community.
Remarkable.
Yes.